Well, hey there, and welcome to Wedding Planning Simplified. Happy Sunday. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Amy from Unmistakably You. I'm a wedding planner and educator here in London, Ontario. And my job in Wedding Planning Simplified is to help you navigate your wedding planning with a minimum of stress and overwhelm, get you to the end of the process, still in love with your fiance. That's the hope. So, as you know, if you're joining us regularly, we go live every Sunday. If you're catching us on the replay, hi, welcome. If you are new to the group, congratulations. We know there have been a lot of engagements happening over the holidays, and if you are one of those engagements, we are so happy for you. Congratulations. It's such an exciting time in your life. If you've been following us for the month, you'll know that we've been doing a series on venues. So we started out by talking just about the differences between different kinds of venues, the differences between an all-inclusive venue, a semi-inclusive venue, which is kind of a made-up thing that I like to think about, to put things in neat little boxes, and then DIY venues, which of course are probably the most involved, well, without a doubt, the most involved kind of venue that you possibly could be holding your wedding at. And that's why today we're diving deeper into what you need to know to navigate planning a wedding at a DIY venue. So thank you for joining. As always, if you have questions or comments, feel free to plug them into the chat. I'm using a third-party streaming site here, so if I don't answer your comment live, it's because I can't see it live, but I will certainly answer any questions that you have after we're done here. So don't hesitate to plug something into the chat. I'm always accessible. You can reach me by email, amy@unmistakably.you.com, or you can send me a private message. You can respond to the video, and we will get you the answers that you need. So welcome. Today we're here to talk about navigating DIY venues, which of course have their own set of difficulties because essentially you're creating a venue out of thin air. And that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. So I'm going to start off with a little plug for wedding planners. Now I'm a realist. I'm also a bit of a cheapskate. So I understand that wedding planning is not in everyone's budget, but can I just make a real plea here that if you are intending to get married at a DIY venue, and by that I mean perhaps a barn or a hall that really doesn't provide any services except for the space. Maybe they provide tables and chairs, but that's it. Or maybe you're getting married on private property under a tent, or maybe in your family's barn, or maybe you're hoping to use a private property and completely dine and dance al fresco under the stars. Essentially, when I talk DIY venues, I'm talking about somewhere where you're bringing in most, if not all, of the elements that you'll need to make your wedding a success. So my plea to you is that if you are hosting a wedding at a DIY venue, and if it's possible at all financially for you, hire a professional to help you. If you can manage to work full wedding planning into your budget, that is amazing. It is going to take so much stress off of your plate. At a minimum, if you can work day of coordination into your budget, it will be so, so helpful to have someone managing all the things on the day so that you don't have to. You don't want to be the one answering your phone. You don't want to be the one solving problems or directing vendors or answering questions. You want to be sitting back, drinking a mimosa, getting your hair and makeup done, celebrating with your friends, your family, and your guests, and not solving problems. So DIY venues have a whole set of individual components that you'll want to think about. And today, that's the plan. Now, if you saw, it'll be either the post above or below this, or however the Facebook gods decide to position it. Earlier today, I did post a resource in the group. So it's a PDF download that has all of this stuff and more in writing. It's going to give you all the things you need to think about with regard to your rentals, your vendors, setup and tear down. It gives you formulas, how much space you'll need depending on the size of table that you have. So check that out. If you can't find it, let me know. I'll send you a copy of it, but it is in the group as a PDF download. So first of all, like I said, if you're newly engaged, congratulations. So exciting. This is our very own Jacqueline in this picture who just got engaged just in the past couple of weeks, and we're so excited for her. Such an exciting time in your life. But we know it can be pretty daunting. So again, we're here to help. If you need help, don't hesitate to reach out, especially when you're first getting started. We have all kinds of resources to help you, including our upcoming budget course. That's one of the first things you need to do, is establish a realistic budget. So on the 23rd and 24th of February, we are offering an in-person and a virtual budget workshop in which we're going to teach you how to create a realistic budget, how to determine what is realistic for you, and you're actually going to leave with that budget in hand. So if you're interested, drop me a note. I'm happy to sign you up. We still have space in both our in-person workshop on the 23rd and our virtual workshop on the 24th. Having a solid budget is the best thing you can possibly do to keep your engagement enjoyable and not full of fights about money. So you are in the right place here. We're here to help. Don't hesitate to drop us a line if we can help you in any way. And let's get on with the show. So let us know questions in the chat. And here we go. DIY venues. Again, if you're just joining, DIY venue means anything that doesn't provide a whole lot of services or equipment or vendors within the package. So the opposite of a DIY venue, if it's kind of an opposite, would be like a hotel or a golf course where they're providing absolutely everything you need from a venue perspective. A DIY venue provides little or nothing that you need, and you're bringing in everything on your own. So we're going to talk about 4 basic steps that you're going to need to do from the beginning straight through to the end of the night at your DIY venue. And those are surveying the site, booking your rentals, dealing with vendors, and setup and tear down. And again, lots more about that in the document that I posted. So if you can find that in the group, you're welcome to download that. Otherwise, reach out and I'll get it for you. When you're surveying the site, the main things you're looking for are what is provided and what do you need to bring in. So first and foremost, does the site match your needs? Don't try, because you have acres and acres of property, to jam a square peg into a round hole and say, oh, we have this property, it's going to be a cheap venue, we're not going to have to pay all of those expensive venue fees, so let's have the wedding here. You would be very surprised once you start totaling up the costs of just renting stuff. Often rentals, tents, tables, chairs, all of that stuff, often it costs $50 per person or more, depending on the choices that you make. So don't try to make it work just because you own property. If you have beautiful property and you've always envisioned getting married in the field or in the woods or in the barn, by all means, that's awesome. It's doable. It's totally doable. I'm not trying to scare you off. There are just a lot of moving pieces. So do think about whether the site matches your needs. When you're thinking about how the flow of the day will go, from ceremony to cocktails to dinner to dancing, perhaps if you're doing a traditional wedding, do you have appropriate space for all of those things? Is it going to be comfortable for guests to travel between those spaces? Are you going to require an army of room flippers to take the ceremony and change it over into reception space? So just think logistically and see whether or not that matches up with your vision of how the day is going to flow. After that, you're going to want to measure. Now, if you are at a barn or a venue that provides you with the space but nothing more, you may find that they have a floor plan drawn up already. If not, you're going to want to measure and create one. Hopefully you can create a scale floor plan if you have that ability using a CAD program, or I always give a plug for allseated.com. I'm not an affiliate with them, but it's a good free website where you can draw up a pretty simple scale floor plan to give yourself a sense of whether or not everything's going to fit. That's really, really important to start with. If you're thinking about having a tent, you need to think about the actual physical ground. Is it level? Is it over top of a septic system or a weeping system? Is there enough space for the guy wires and the anchors and the tent pegs that you're going to need to secure that tent to the ground? Is it away from power lines? Think about things like that. And then whether you're in an existing space like a barn or a drive shed, or whether you're building a space in a tent, for instance, think about the location of power. Think about what you're going to do for water supply, and that also goes with washrooms. And think about where guests are going to park, especially if you're doing this on private property. You'll need to think about whether they're parking in a field. What happens if that field is muddy and soupy because it's been raining all week? Are they going to park along the sides of the road? Is that safe? Are there any municipal bylaws that would prohibit you parking along the side of the road? So thinking about that is going to be really important. Making sure that you have adequate access to power is really, really important as well. You would be absolutely shocked to realize how much power a coffee urn draws, for instance. It's kind of ridiculous, but the number of times I've had to go flip breakers because the coffee urn has blown the breakers, which, by the way, is also a really good thing to make sure somebody knows on the day of the wedding, is where the breakers or the fuse panel is located. And then water and washrooms as well. Are you going to let your guests use the house washrooms, or if it's in a barn or a drive shed, are there washrooms there, or do you need to bring in a washroom trailer or self-standing units, porta potty units? Don't forget about hand wash stations if you're doing individual porta potty units, especially with COVID concerns lingering. You're going to want to make sure that guests have lots of access to ability to wash their hands and sanitizer. Does your caterer need water? Thinking about if you're bringing in dinnerware from a rental company, most rental companies are going to want it to be scraped and rinsed before it's returned. So it's very difficult to do that if you don't have a water source. With regard to power, again, you need to think about things other than just the caterer. You need to think about that washroom trailer, which is going to need power. You need to think about your lighting. You need to think about your DJ or your band. All of those things draw power. And if you're out in the middle of a beautiful, pristine forest, chances are pretty good that you don't have a 200 amp service running into your oak tree next door. So thinking about perhaps needing to rent generators is something that you'll have to have on the radar before you commit to anything. If you are at a venue like, for instance, a barn that provides tables and chairs, but nothing else, make sure that you have a list of that so that you know exactly what you need. What sizes of tables do they offer? If they're providing chairs, do they have double chairs for ceremony and reception, or are you going to end up having to move chairs in between? Thinking about those kinds of things before you sign on the dotted line is really important. For tents, I mentioned you're going to want level ground that's not over top of any kind of septic system. You also need to think, though, about permits. Municipalities set their own bylaws, but in most areas, the municipality is going to require a building permit for a tent over a certain number of square feet. So make sure you look into that. And often your tent rental company will have all of that information at their fingertips, and they'll be able to tell you exactly what to do and how to do it. Now, when we do deal with that rental company, often on private property or at a DIY venue, you're bringing in an awful lot of rentals. The list could get really long. So the kinds of things that you're going to have on your radar are, of course, if you're in the middle of a field, a tent. Now, I have had couples who say, we want to dine and dance under the stars. And you see all these beautiful photos of Edison lights strung in the trees and these beautiful outdoor events, which are lovely. However, we're not living in Italy. We are living in Southern Ontario. I mean, if you are living in Italy and you're listening from there, kudos, good for you. I wish I were there right now. But I'm here in Southern Ontario, where the reality is that it can get really hot and very uncomfortably sunny in the summer, but it can also get really cool in the evenings if you're getting married earlier or later in the season. And then, of course, there is the danger of rain. So make sure that you are prepared for all of those things. I would recommend having a tent on backup. If you have no other option, if there's not a building on site that you could move to in the event of inclement weather, have a tent on backup. You can always make the decision closer to the wedding. If you get the forecast, the 7-day forecast, you can cancel the tent. Chances are pretty good that you're going to lose your deposit, and you have to be okay with that. And you have to be okay with knowing that storms can blow up out of nowhere. So much as I don't necessarily love the aesthetics of a tent, if you're getting married on private property with no other option for shelter, it's pretty much a necessity. So you're going to want to talk to your rental company about the size of tent that you're going to need. And you're going to want to also remember that you have to leave space for the other stuff that has to go in the tent. You're not just putting tables with guests. You're also likely going to have to account for a dance floor. And don't forget about those auxiliary tables. So things like your guest book table, your gift table. If you have a favor table or a cake table, you're going to presumably want to put a bar in that tent. If you're having a buffet dinner, your caterers are going to need space for tables. So make sure that you have enough space, not just for your guests, but for all of those extra things that you're going to want to put under your tent. And think about whether or not you want to have tables set up on your dance floor and then have to break them down after dinner before you dance, or whether you want to have a large enough tent that you don't have to have those tables on the dance floor. And these are all things that any reputable tent company will be able to help you with. So make sure that you talk to them. They will probably have sample floor plans for 100 guests, 150 guests, 100 guests with no dance floor, 100 guests with a dance floor. So make sure that you know exactly what it is that they're providing for you before you commit to a particular size of tent. You're going to, like I said earlier, you're going to want to think about chairs as well as tables. I've got formulas in that download that I mentioned that's posted in the group. So it will tell you how much space you need for rectangle tables versus round tables. And if you're looking to keep space down, you're going to want to use those rectangle tables. But when you're thinking about what kind of tables you want, don't forget that they're also going to need linen. If you're renting harvest tables, they are larger than your standard banquet table. So you have to account for a 40-inch width with a harvest table as opposed to a 30-inch width with a regular banquet table. So just be aware of exactly how those things you're putting in your tent are going to affect your overall space, which again is why having a scale floor plan is so important. With your chairs, think about whether you're going to want to have one set of chairs or two sets of chairs. Probably, I would say 60% of my outdoor weddings have the same set of chairs. And at the end of the ceremony, the officiant just says, "Hey, guests, if you're physically able, please take your chair and move it to your reception space." You can also have your young cousins who are looking for something to do. You could have the partners of your wedding party while your wedding party's taking photos. You could hire in minions. Find ways to move those chairs if you don't want the expense of renting two sets of chairs, but definitely something to think about when you're setting up those rentals initially, because you want to make sure that you've accounted for or that you've reserved enough inventory. If you decide 2 weeks before the wedding that you do actually want to add a second set of chairs, what happens if there aren't any available from your rental company? So Christina, hi, how are you doing? It's allseated.com. So Christina's just wondering about the website that I use. It's totally free. You can create a scale floor plan. It has all kinds of automatic additions that are to scale. So standard tables are in there, and it will show you the perimeter that you need around them for seating and for service and for walkways. So it's allseated.com. And I'll plug that into the chat after we're done here. I can't actually post comments while I'm talking, but I'll do that after I'm done. I mentioned washrooms before. So if you're renting a washroom trailer, be aware that you're going to need space for that. And that space needs to be level. It needs to have access to power. And in some cases, it needs to have access to water. Most of those trailers come with a reservoir, but just be aware that it's going to have to get filled up once it gets to your site. Most places won't pull a trailer that's full of water because it's so heavy. So think about those kinds of things if you're renting a washroom trailer. If you're renting individual units, you're going to want about 1 unit per 50 guests. So thinking about where those are going to go. Don't forget the hand wash stations. A lot of portable toilet rental companies do have some kind of wedding or upscale unit that has a hand wash station right in it. You may want to bring in a separate hand wash station just for people who literally just want to wash their hands before dinner. So thinking about the location of those washrooms as well as the travel path to those washrooms. If it's far away from the tent, presumably it's going to get dark at some point, and you're going to want to make sure that you have enough lighting for guests so that they stay safe on the way to the washrooms. If it does happen to be inclement weather, how far are they going to have to walk to get to the washrooms? Is it going to be muddy and soupy? If that's the case, you might want to think about bringing in some straw or some wood chips, or maybe you have access to those big industrial rubber mats that they use in horse barns. Anything like that can help you to control muddy ground, which is something that you'll want to think about in advance because you don't want somebody running around on the day of your wedding looking for bags of wood chips. So think about the location of the washrooms, the access to the washrooms. Maybe you want to rent a small canopy, or maybe you have one of those 10 by 10 pop-up tents that you could put outside the washroom. Again, just in case it does happen to rain and someone waiting on the washroom then doesn't have to stand in the rain. You can also, if the weather looks bad, come up with, baskets of umbrellas that stay at the entrance and exit to your tent. Lots of ways to make sure that you're accounting for potential bad weather. Thinking about lighting is something I mentioned before as well, but you're going to want to make sure that there's adequate lighting, not only in your tent, but also at the washrooms, on the way to the parking, anywhere that your guests are likely to be traveling in the dark. If you have a fire pit out in the bush, how are they going to get from the tent to the fire pit safely? So you want to make sure that you're thinking about guest comfort and guest safety with regard to lighting. Also be aware that if you're intending to have a dance, guests don't want to dance if it's super, super bright. So be mindful of the lighting options that you are putting into your tent or bringing into your barn. If it's a facility that you have to bring in lighting and it doesn't already exist, just be aware that those Edison bulbs can be really, really bright. And if you deck out your entire tent or your entire barn with Edison bulbs, it's going to be pretty bright, and guests might not be so willing to dance unless you unplug them, and there goes your ambiance, right? So the list could go on and on in terms of things that you'll want to rent, but it really depends on your specific site, which is why if you are working with a tent company that does do a site visit, so important, because they will come out to your site. They'll talk you through all of this. You can mention where the power and where the water is, and they'll bring up all kinds of ideas that you may not have even thought of and that I didn't cover here. But definitely the main things to think about are the tent, what goes in the tent, tables and chairs, dinnerware. Your caterer may provide that, but you may need to rent dinnerware, in which case make sure you talk to your caterer about exactly what they need. And don't forget about cocktail hour and dinner and late night when you're renting dinnerware, as well as bar glass if you're going to serve with actual glassware from the bar. If not, thinking about providing plastic. Now, your vendors at a DIY wedding are all going to be coming in independently, presumably, and you are managing them. You don't have the luxury of a venue coordinator or of, a hall manager. It's going to be you that needs to make sure that your vendors are set up for success. And so this, again, not to blow the horn of wedding planners too much here, but that's where having someone who is a third party, a neutral body to direct vendors, to help them to solve their problems on the day of the wedding so nobody calls you, is really kind of important. But it's also important that you set your vendors up for success right from the beginning. So make sure that you have conversations about all of this stuff. And again, check that document for more ideas that you'll want to talk about, and get everything in writing. So when you're dealing with your rental company, you'll want to make sure of a couple of things. Know their policies regarding delivery. Do they only deliver on a particular day? Or is there a little bit of flexibility, particularly if you're having a tent wedding and it's looking like it's going to rain the couple of days before the wedding? Is it possible to get that tent put up before it rains to keep the ground under the tent dry? When they deliver, how far will they take your stuff? Some rental companies, in fact, most rental companies, stipulate a certain number of meters from the truck that they will carry your chairs and your tables and all of your other stuff. If your tent is way back in the middle of the field and the truck can't access it, are you then going to have to shuttle all of those tables and chairs and generators and everything else back there? Make sure that your site is accessible for your rental truck. If they're delivering a large number of rentals, they're probably going to come in a big truck. And so thinking about, if the ground is wet, is there an alternate path that they can take so that they don't tear up the wet ground and make it into a muddy mess? You also need to know their policies about where their stuff is kept. Most rental companies will require that everything stays under cover. So you might not be able to set up your ceremony chairs under the oak tree the night before because the rental company has said, no, everything needs to stay covered at all times. You also need to make sure that you know what their policies are for pickup at the end of the event. Most rental companies will ask you to have things stacked, piled. I work with one here in town where they have covers for all of their Chiavari chairs, and those all have to be put back on. So knowing their policies for delivery and setup, but also tear down and pickup, they're not going to collapse your tables for you in most cases. They're going to be looking for you to have someone to do the hard setup and the hard tear down. When you're dealing with your caterers, make sure they absolutely know, and if they'll do a site visit, that's super awesome as well. Make sure they know that they're in a tent or that they're in a barn. Make sure they know that there's no kitchen facility, there's no plating facilities, there's no cleanup facilities. You'll need to ask if they require a tent, in which case they're going to need some lighting as well. You'll want to know what they need for power and water requirements. If you are renting dinnerware, like I said, it's going to have to be scraped and rinsed at the end of the night. So are they going to do that for you? If so, they need water. One of the things that nobody ever thinks to ask, and it makes sense that you don't think to ask this, because if you go to a restaurant, there's water on your table. But one of the things nobody thinks to ask is, will you put water on the tables for my guests? And many caterers, when they're doing an off-site catering at a barn, a tent, a hall, they're actually not going to put water on your tables unless you ask them to. So that might be something that you have to have someone else do. Maybe your bartenders. Maybe you need to bring in a couple of extra service staff. So don't assume that your caterers are going to come into the middle of your back 40 and serve like it's a Michelin star restaurant in your tent. You need to be very clear on what they do, what they don't do, how long they're there, what they're providing, what they're bringing in with them. If there's no drinkable water on site, you're going to have to provide that. So that either falls to you or to the caterers. So you need to make sure that you cover those bases before the day of, when you realize that it's 30 degrees outside and there's no water for your guests to drink. You'll also need to think about access for the caterers, just like with the rental company, and also in most cases with your DJ and your band, and maybe some cases with your bartenders as well. Think about whether there's a clear path for them to come into the area where they'll be setting up, and think about the timing of when they're coming in. You don't want a big, heavy catering truck rumbling down your driveway during your ceremony. So make sure that you communicate with all of the vendors who are coming in when the ceremony is and when they can't possibly arrive. Be there before or after, but not during. Keep in mind that caterers may need to make trips in and out throughout the course of the event. If there's no cooking facilities on site, in a lot of cases, they'll be cooking off site and bringing food in, and they're not going to cook your late night food at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and have it sit in a hot box for 8 hours. They're going to cook it later and bring it in later. So you need to make sure that those passageways for access are available for the duration of the wedding. With regard to your bartenders, first of all, smart serve bartenders, liquor licensing or special occasion permits, and party alcohol liability. Alcohol liability insurance is so important. So make sure if you're doing your own bar that you have all of those bases covered. It's the CYA policy. Please cover your ass. I do not ever want to see anybody getting into some kind of a lawsuit or a court case because of liquor liability and you didn't spend the $250 on a policy. So make sure that you've got your butt covered. And then with your bartenders, a lot of bartenders will come in and they just come themselves. They bring their person and that is all. So you need to think about who's going to provide all of the stuff that they need: corkscrews, jiggers, ice buckets and tongs, bowls to put the garnish in, bar cloths. Maybe they need a cutting board and a knife if they're going to be cutting up your garnish. So make sure that you're aware of what they're bringing versus what you have to provide for them. If you're providing the alcohol and the mix and the garnish and the ice, make sure that you have some kind of reliable, reputable calculator to tell you how much of everything you need to buy. Make sure that you have enough space to store the ice. You need a ridiculous amount of ice if you're having a wedding outdoors in the height of summer. So make sure that you have a ton of coolers or access to a freezer or you can rent these big super cooler things. Make sure that you have enough ice and enough space to store it. It also takes a ton of ice if you're dumping all of your beer and pop and water into a trough. It takes a lot of ice to cool that down and cover it. So make sure that you've got lots and lots of ice, and we have all those bar calculators. So if you need those, reach out. I'm happy to share. You'll also need to talk with your bartenders about teardown. First of all, make sure that they don't open anything they don't need. If it's 12:30 at night, they just finished a bottle of vodka and there's only one person drinking vodka, tell them not to open another bottle because you can return anything that's unopened. Are they going to pack up your empties for you at the end of the night? Are they going to make sure that everything gets neatly put in one location? Will they pack it into your truck for you? Can you leave leftover alcohol on site? If you're renting a barn, for instance, is it okay for you to leave your leftover alcohol there, or do you need to take it out at the end of the night? If you're not cleaning up until the next day, some venues are okay with you leaving it. Some venues require that it be taken off site. With regard to your DJ and band, and I mentioned them specifically because of power, so don't forget to ask them how much space they need and also what power requirements they have, especially if you're in a barn or a shed or a tent that doesn't have adequate power supply. You might need to bring in a generator. There are these great whisper generators that you can get that are hardly make any noise at all. You just need to make sure that you have someone to check that the gas gets refilled so you don't run out of power in the middle of your event. You also need to think about your DJ and your band and where you're going to feed them. That applies to any vendor. I'm not specifically talking about photographers or videographers or planners on this slide, just because they don't have the power and water and all of those requirements. I mean, it's a little easier for a photographer to shoot a wedding on private property than it is for a DJ to come in and set up on private property if there's not adequate power. So you want to make sure with your DJ or your band that you have power not only where they're going to be for the dance part of the evening, but if the ceremony location is different, you're going to have to run power there. If the cocktail location is different, you're going to have to make sure there's power there. So make sure that there's power run to everywhere that the DJ or the band is going to be performing. And then find them a seat for dinner. Most DJs want to eat at their DJ booth, but if you have a band, chances are pretty good they're not going to want to eat on the stage. So you might need to have a separate band table. You might need to find a separate place for them to eat as well. Now, when it comes to setup and teardown, you need to plan this out well in advance and visualize exactly what you intend to have happen and then write it down, because it is going to be like herding cats during the setup and teardown portion, especially if you have limited time. If you're on private property, chances are pretty good that you can take all the time you want to set up. So in that case, try to do it sooner rather than later. But if you're renting a barn or a venue that provides you with just the space, they may have a rental the day before and you may not be able to set up the day before. So a solid plan is going to help you immensely in keeping people under control. And then with teardown, remember that if it's happening the day after the wedding, you might have some hungover people and they might not have a whole lot of initiative. If you're tearing down at the end of the night, oh my gosh, keep safety in mind, because you absolutely don't want anybody who's, completely 3 sheets to the wind at the top of a 20-foot ladder. So lots of things to think through. I would always advise you to make lists and to assign responsibilities. I, of course, am the queen of charts and lists, and I love me a good Excel sheet. But make sure that you've thought through who's doing what. Make sure that when you're packing up your items, you pack them up in a way that makes sense. I like to suggest that if you have all of your items for your welcome table in the same box or the same tote, that's a really great way to make it easier for the people who are setting up, because you can put a list of what's on there. You can even set it up at home, do a mock-up, take a picture of it and tape it to the box so that whoever's setting up can kind of just go and do it without you having to direct them, because your head is going to be in a million different directions as you're doing the setup. Think about who's doing what I call the hard setup. So by that, I mean tables, chairs, generators, bars, anything that is big and heavy that needs to be set in place. And you're going to want to have some, strong people to do that, or you're going to need to have worker bees from your catering company or from your planning company. You're going to have to make sure that somebody does that. And then think about your soft setup. And by that, I mean things like linens and paper products and decor. When I talk about hard setup, I usually want that to be done the day before if you're on private property or if you have access to the venue. Some of your soft setup can be done the day before as well. You can certainly put your linens on the tables, but just be mindful of the fact that if you're in a tent or a mostly outdoor venue, things get damp overnight in our climate. So if you have floor length linens, try to pick them up and puddle them on the chairs or fold them over onto the top of the table. If you're setting out paper products like place cards or table numbers, or if you have photo displays, don't put those out until the day before because the damp will make them curl up. You'll also want to think about your table settings. If you're in a barn or a tent, are there animals or dust and dirt flying around? I would always advise, if you're setting the tables the day before, that you put your glasses upside down so that you don't get bugs or other animal refuse in them. And if you're setting out plates, try and keep them covered. So if you're, again, if you've got those long linens, set your tables and then fold your linens gently up over top of your table settings to protect from any kind of dirt or bugs or anything that could get onto them. Try and keep your tent closed overnight if you're in a tent, or keep your barn doors closed so that animals don't get in. And then if you do have those things that need to get put out on the day of, like your paper products, your guest book, your favor display maybe, who's going to do that? So again, if you have a coordinator, that's a really great job for them. Most coordinators include your soft setup with their packages. So that's something that you'll want to make sure you have somebody in charge of, because you don't want your mom doing that and missing, that awesome photo where she's lacing up the back of your dress. When you're thinking about tearing down, again, think about safety. If you have to be out that night, be mindful of people who've been drinking. You probably could get some beautiful photos of yourself on a ladder, but you want them to be intentional. You don't want to be on a ladder in your wedding dress at 1 a.m, taking down the lighting from the top of your tent. So think about safety and think about practicality at the end of the night if you're tearing down. If you need to be out of the venue by the end of the night, I would advise having some people on board to tear down who are maybe third parties. Maybe you bring in a crew. Maybe you're leaving it to your decorator. Maybe your coordinator can bring in some extra bodies. If you have until the next day to tear down, again, be mindful of people maybe being hungover. You'll want to know what time you have to be out in case there's another rental coming in. And you'll want to also be mindful of avoiding those extra charges that I kind of alluded to before from your rental suppliers, in the event that, maybe your caterers didn't rinse the dishes or couldn't rinse the dishes, or maybe those chairs and tables don't get stacked, or maybe they're too far away from where the rental truck can access. So just thinking about making sure that things are left the way the rental company wants them left is going to help you to avoid those extra charges. Now, I could talk forever, and I've talked for 37 minutes and 48 seconds already about the kinds of things that you might run into. That's just the tip of the iceberg, friends. So know that I am always here for support. If you are doing a DIY venue, we're happy to consult, or if we're available, we're happy to come in and provide you with services on the day. I can't stress enough how important it is to have someone there that's not you. That's not your mom. That's not your maid of honor. You want somebody there who's going to deal with the nitty-gritty so that you don't have to. Something else that I didn't talk about that I could, again, do a whole live about and write a whole blog about is guest comfort. Often if you're at a DIY venue like a tent or a barn, you're going to want to think about the elements and how to keep your guests comfortable. So I wrote a fair bit about that in a blog post a little while ago. So head on over to our blog. It's www.unmistakably.you.com, and then you'll find lots of helpful blog posts there. As always, if you have questions about anything, feel free to reach out. You can get me at my email, amy@unmistakably.you.com. You can send us a private message. You can put a comment in this live. We're everywhere. Find us, ask us for help. We're here to help. hopefully you are gearing up for an enjoyable rest of your weekend, and I will catch you here next week when we're talking about micro weddings and hopefully giving you some helpful tips if that's the route that you're going. So have a great week. Don't hesitate to reach out if we can help, and I will catch you next week. Take care.